they were given a very difficult math test. So I think what they did is they took the most difficult math problem from the GREs. It used to be, before all of this was computerized and the questions you got were a function of what you had already answered, people like me, when we took the GREs, they were on paper, and the funny thing about paper tests is that they can't change as you're taking them, like a test could on a computer. So everybody has the same questions, which means that everybody, even if you were not getting all the easy ones wrong, you still had to look at the really hard ones. So they took the really hard questions from that GRE, gave it to the subjects who were Asian American female Harvard undergraduates. The independent variable had to do with what identity was primed. The way they did this was using the subtle identity prime taken from the last study that I told you about. A third of the subjects were randomly assigned to the gender prime condition. In this condition, subjects, before they started doing the math problems, they had to check off on the cover sheet whether they were male or female. So that primed their gender, and theoretically would have primed a negative stereotype about women and performance in math and science. A third of the subjects had the race prime, so for them, before they started answering the questions on the cover sheet, they had to respond to what their racial background was, thereby presumably activating the Asian identity. And then the final third of subjects had the same questions, but they were not asked for their gender or racial background. So we need this condition with no prime to see what performance would be on these difficult questions to begin with. The dependent variable in the study is the percentage of items that people get correct on a math test. Now, subjects are randomly assigned. So by random assignment, there should be no differences in ability between the three conditions. So we need the control condition to tell us how many questions people in the sample, the Asian American female subjects, got correct without any prime. And they got about half of them correct, so 49%. So if there is no effect of the prime, then people in the race prime and the gender prime condition should also get around 50% correct. To the extent that that prime has an effect, then the groups would be different. And in fact, what they found is that the primes did have an effect. When race was primed, making the Asian identity more salient, actually performance went up a little bit to 54%. So it's like improvement in performance, positive stereotype actually leading to increased performance. However, when gender was primed, by asking subjects whether they were male or female before taking the test, performance went down to 43% correct. Now these are small but significant effects, and a couple of things that are important about them. One is that the positive stereotype did improve performance. Now this is a little bit tricky for the model because it is sort of better at accounting for negative stereotype effects than for positive. So one has to sort of think about whether anxiety and worry could increase performance. And quite honestly, positive stereotype effects are just not well handled by the model. You can sort of fit them in, but they're not, as I would say, elegantly explained as negative stereotype effects. The other thing that I think is really important about these findings are that, again, it's such a small, subtle prime, just simply responding to a question, are you male or female, or what's your racial background? That small prime is enough to modulate performance. And so it really is a reminder that our performance on these tests can be really modulated quite a bit by situational factors, in this case, our awareness of stereotypes, what stereotype we think is most relevant, and whether we're the target of that stereotype or not. Yeah?
Has anyone ever tried trying to predict their
They must have done it. My guess is that what happens is they cancel each other out. So basically you end up with 49%, so that it's not statistically significantly different. Is there a question? Yeah?
Why does it appear that race being a factor makes it go up?
So in this case, it has to do with the content of the stereotype. So the explanation here is that there's a positive stereotype about Asian individuals' performance on math tests. There's a stereotype that Asians are better at that. So the positive stereotype would bump up performance, but in cases where the stereotype is a group does less well on the intelligence test or math test, then activating that stereotype would reduce performance. So the performance goes in line with the stereotype. It is fully a self-fulfilling prophecy, which can go either way. It's just that this theory, anxiety, worry, self-doubt, doesn't fit quite as well for explaining positive effects as negative ones. So this, as I mentioned, is really very hot now in the literature, and people are looking at all different sorts of stereotypes, age stereotypes affecting older people's ability and performance. And so it's really, I think, a powerful model. And when we talk at the end of our discussion on prejudice of interventions to reduce prejudice, some of the most promising interventions have actually been based on trying to interfere with this process. We'll come back to that. So I'll actually sort of shift gears and talk about some other perspectives that have been popular, so you have some way of comparing stereotype threat theory to other social psychological approaches that have been offered to explain stereotypes, prejudice, and behavior. And so whereas stereotype threat theory really puts the emphasis on stereotypes, our performance is impaired because of the presence of stereotypes, older theories in social psychology thought that prejudice was the root of discrimination. So stereotype threat theory says that beliefs are the most important thing. But the older approaches in social psychology really believed that prejudice came first and that stereotype beliefs emerged from prejudice. This distinction is important because it's going to be critical in telling us where we might want to intervene to reduce these effects. Do we intervene on beliefs or on feelings? So let me talk about the primary theories of prejudice that were out there and the studies that emerged to support the theories. And they looked at, where does prejudice come from and how does prejudice lead to stereotypes? Because again, they believed that prejudicial attitudes were at the root of these processes, unlike in stereotype threat theory, where the belief is that stereotype beliefs are at the root. The earliest social psychological theory of prejudice and the origins and maintenance of prejudice is known as realistic conflict theory. The basic idea of realistic conflict theory is that prejudice is not irrational. Instead, prejudice is a rational response that groups have when they are in conflict with one another over limited resources. This is a prime example of what I talked about as the socio-cultural approach to social psychology on the first day of class, because realistic conflict theory is really about how groups just interact with each other out of necessity. It's not about the content of the groups or who's in the groups or what the groups believe. It's just that groups, such as they are, have this way of interacting such that when they are in competition with one another for limited resources, when there's something that the groups want and there's not enough of that something for the groups to have as much of it as they want, the groups are going to end up in conflict with each other. And when groups end up in conflict with each other, they develop prejudicial attitudes that benefit their in-group, the group that they're a member of, and end up disliking and having stereotype beliefs ultimately about the out-group, the group that they are competing against.